Today on the TMZ Podcast.
Welcome to the TMZ Podcast. Derek and Eric here. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we've got day 2 of the Oscar fallout. The story is no longer about everything everywhere all at once, but now it's about Jimmy Kimmel's jokes, and some of the jokes in particular that he made at the expense of one Pauly Shore. And if you're our age, you know Pauly Shore. He was gigantic.
Well, I think even younger people, it is, and to the point of all of this, like in the 90s, he was such a big thing. He was big on MTV. Then he had a ton of big movies. Encino Man, obviously, where his co-stars both won Oscars over the weekend. But Pauly Shore's been kind of a joke with a lot of people. He's been a punchline for years.
Yeah, Pauly Shore is one of those guys you bring up as a cheap shot. I mean, he is a cheap shot magnet because of the nature of his career and the types of movies that came out in the early 90s when he did Encino Man and Biodome, and he had these sort of I'm the Weasel, and they feel very 90s. People take a lot of shots at him, and Jimmy Kimmel didn't really hold back. Here's what he had to say at the Oscars.
31 years ago in 1992, Brendan Fraser and Ke Huy Quan were in a movie together. Remember which movie it was? Encino Man. 2 actors from Encino Man are nominated for Oscars. Okay? What an incredible night this must be for the two of you, and what a very difficult night for Pauly Shore.
So, Eric, when I heard the joke, I was like, oh, you could see it coming from a mile away because Encino Man is really a Pauly Shore movie.
And it's kind of a hacky joke almost. It's like, other comedians made fun of like Pauly Shore or like, remember Carrot Top? People always would just take it's an easy target. Yeah. Well, Pauly at first just said he loved it about the joke on Twitter, but now he's like, it hurt his feelings. I think maybe it's because, he's heard a lot of jokes about himself over the years. But I think, on the night when 2 of his co-stars are winning Oscars for these big movies, that he feels like, why are you kicking me while I'm down? So Pauly spoke to Page 6, and he said, we love to hate people when they're on top. People wanted to smash me down, and they did. He says, I was always nice to everyone, always cool. I put my heart into all my films. You're buying and selling a human being. He's saying that I have feelings. And
here's the other thing about Pauly Shore through the years. After the 90s, he did have a lot of comments like this that showed a sort of sensitivity to the criticism. And I think that's why he is this target, because he had this sort of ridiculous persona, and he doesn't sort of have much of a sense of humor about himself a lot, notwithstanding the fact that Pauly Shore is the daughter of Mitzi Shore, who ran the Comedy Store. You'd think he would be fine with all the slings and arrows, but he's also sort of grew up a rich kid and kind of a privileged kid, and sometimes he doesn't like the insults being hurled in his direction. Do you get that sense, Eric?
Yeah, but also Pauly Shore's whole thing, his whole persona, the Weasel, and like kind of vaguely stonery, whatever the Pauly Shore character was, it wasn't mean.
No, it certainly wasn't. That brand of comedy was not mean-spirited. And
it was a character. Like Jimmy Kimmel, they're both comedians, but Jimmy Kimmel's not playing a character. He's Jimmy Kimmel.
That's right.
Pauly Shore, the person, is different than Pauly Shore, the character that was in all the movies. And I think people kind of lose sight of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although it was a career choice to be this type of character. He slipped on this persona, which has aged in an interesting way. I think some of us look back fondly on the Weasel stuff, but it also feels kind of hacky to have a persona. It's sort of like in the 90s and 80s, they had sitcoms with taglines. It was of that moment, but most of them are able to sort of either gracefully enter the next stage of their career. Pauly hasn't really, he's mature, but he's also quite sensitive about that past.
He is. It's weird because, like you said, like sitcoms, like Jaleel White that played Urkel.
Yes.
And people like that have their kind of bitterness about it a little bit, but those were very clearly defined characters.
Yes.
That like I'm an actor playing a character on a sitcom. Pauly Shore, the character was Pauly Shore. People don't really know how much of it was actually him, how much of it was the character. And it was not that respected at the time. It was very successful, but real comedians always sort of like, oh, this is lowest common denominator. Like, he wasn't respected, I think. And maybe now as he's getting older, especially seeing his peers, when Encino Man came out, Pauly Shore was the star.
Oh, absolutely.
Brendan Fraser was not a thing yet, and Ke Huy Quan was a child actor still trying to get adult roles. So it was a Pauly Shore vehicle for sure. And maybe now to see them getting all these accolades and him being literally reduced to a punchline, it's got to be a little upsetting.
That's the thing. I don't think he's sort of embittered to the point where he's sort of lashing out at Kiwi Kwan and Brendan Fraser. I do think he's sort of proud of them and proud to have been in a movie with them earlier in their career. He's not begrudging, but it must be something to see those guys mature into seasoned actors who are now, finally getting their accolades in Hollywood and critical acclaim. Pauly Shore never really had that move to move into a critical darling. Now, if you look at his IMDb, the guy's been active. Now, he was a massive star in the early 90s, so all those movies made, probably hundreds of millions at the box office.
That's the thing. That's one of those things. They weren't massive blockbuster movies. They weren't making hundreds of millions each,
but they were culturally impactful.
And they were not expensive films. These weren't effects-laden blockbusters. If Son-in-Law and Biodome could make $30 million, well, they probably cost $5 million.
Yeah.
So they were money makers. It was consistent, but he was his own niche for a while.
Yeah, and so look, as I look back on this, with Jimmy Kimmel's performance, I actually thought it was okay, with the exception of these two jokes. This joke I thought was a little bit cheap. Jimmy came out, he didn't do the Ricky Gervais thing. He wasn't as acid dipped as Ricky at the Golden Globes, and he wasn't as soft as a Billy Crystal would be at the Oscars. He was somewhere in the middle.
Right.
But I thought this joke and the Robert Blake text if you would like to see him in the In Memoriam, I thought we're on the wrong side of taste in some ways, because that guy just died. He does have a family. He was acquitted of murder, although he's a very sort of controversial figure. And Pauly Shore didn't need the cheap shot. It was sort of there, and he did the layup, and he wasn't there to defend himself. And so I sort of understand.
Do you wish he had been and done a full Will Smith, gone up there and just smacked the crap out of Jimmy Kimmel? And also you got to remember, Jimmy Kimmel is fairly respected at this point, but he was the host of the Man Show. He played bongo. You're in a little bit of a glass house there yourself, Jimmy Kimmel.
He is, and he's been able to sort of manage that past and sort of gracefully enter the 21st century in a way that others haven't. I mean, the Man Show with Carolla and Jimmy Kimmel hasn't really been re-examined in the way that you would think it would be, because he's now got so many sort of, let's call them liberal bona fides. Everyone knows where Jimmy Kimmel stands. He's done enough monologues where he's tearful about the state of healthcare and so forth that he's been able to kind of erase that history in a way.
He's apologized for it and kind of moved on. But also, the Man Show, it was a thing, but it wasn't as big as Pauly Shore was in the early 90s.
I think that's right.
And but also, the funny thing is, now that he says, I could kind of see Pauly having sort of a comeback, because, like you said, I mean, his mom owned the Comedy Store, which is a legendary LA venue where a lot of famous comedians got their start. So Pauly grew up in that world. I could see him kind of turning that into, doing a series about it that could be respected.
I agree completely. He can leverage this moment at the Oscars, these kind of cheap shots, into a project about sort of the arc of his career, or maybe a postmodern take on what it is to be Pauly Shore in sort of the current landscape. I agree completely.
Maybe not winning an Oscar, but I could see him putting a little respect on his own name.
Yeah, because there is depth to him. Sure. When he has comments like this, it's not that he's unthoughtful or unmindful of how he's perceived in Hollywood. And I would watch something like that on Showtime.
It'd be really fun if he made a movie about that and got his own old co-stars to be in it. Imagine a Pauly Shore movie where it's starring Academy Award winner Brendan Fraser,
It'd be incredible.
Academy Award winner Ki Kwan, and Pauly Shore.
Who's not watching that?
I would watch that in a heartbeat.
All right, let's move on to the other very big story of the day, and this one's sort of interesting. I'm interested in your take. Diplo was on a podcast with Emily Ratajkowski.
Right.
On Tuesday, it's her High Low podcast, and he told her a story about So this sort of conversation evolved. It started with him saying, "I'm not aroused by men that much. However, I'm sure I've gotten oral sex from a guy before, for sure, 100%, basically, yeah." So when he says this to her, he says, I don't see myself as gay, but I think I've received oral from a man. And she presses him on this topic, and it's interesting to hear how he responds. Take a listen.
Sure, if I got a blowjob from a guy before.
You're sure that's happened?
Yeah.
And you just don't remember?
I mean,
you're saying you're not committing to it, but you're saying you're sure it happened.
For sure.
But you don't have a specific memory of it.
I don't know if it's gay unless you make eye contact while there's the blowjob.
That's such a straight guy thing to say.
But getting a blowjob is not that gay, I think.
I don't know. You tell me.
But what were we about to talk about?
We were talking about Bill Clinton. Because this is a serious podcast, okay?
This is fascinating to me because he initially tries to brush it off with this joke about eye contact, and Emily doesn't let him off the hook. She says she gives him the sort of I call it the Olay move when a defender in basketball sort of moves his legs to let a person fall down. She sort of allows it to expand, and she says, "I don't know. I'm asking you.
She's
this
giving
is
him
your
enough rope.
story." She gives him enough rope to hang himself, and he really does. What did you make of this?
Well, the sidebar before we get into the whole sexuality thing, the fact that he's not pretty sure, but not entirely sure if he has or not. Is what you kind of know or you don't.
Well, I don't know. So
that's the DJ life, I guess.
Exactly. I took that to mean he lives a very colorful life in very late nights, maybe lots of drug-fueled evenings or alcohol-fueled evenings where he genuinely doesn't remember. I think guys who party in Vegas till 4 a.m. regularly may not remember some of their sexual encounters. I certainly remember every one of mine, Eric.
Well, I mean, both of them? All right.
Yeah, all two of them. I had two beautiful kids out of it. So at first I read this as it made me a little uncomfortable because I hate this kind of macho posturing. I hate this hey, boy, I was just getting it, so I'm not gay as long as I didn't have a wiener in my mouth. I hate that stuff.
This is the interesting thing about this to me. And he goes on to talk about how he's definitely, he's not gay because he's dated a lot of very famous women and seems, genuinely into, Katy Perry and MIA. But he also says he could see himself dating a guy life partner-wise. What's interesting about it to me is that Diplo's 44.
Yes.
And I think we know, Gen Z and probably younger millennials are totally fine with, they're whatever, sexuality's fluid and gender's fluid, and that they don't really make that big of a deal of it. Guys in their 40s, it's weird that you said he's in this sort of in-between thing where he's like, I'm fluid, I don't care, whatever, but also he's doing that kind of macho posturing, if you don't look him in the eyes, it's not gay.
I agree. He's
like
in this.
He's like an 80s teen movie jock.
But he's 44. To your point where it's it's not funny anymore. I'm not in high school. You're not in high school. So the macho posturing is stale. Yet he's also 44, so he should have kind of figured out where he stands in terms of his fluidity. Not figure it out on a podcast with Emily Ratajkowski.
That he's sort of approaching it like he's 20.
Yes.
It seems like he's almost railing against old people that try and put people in boxes and stuff, but then he's also trying to create that box to put himself in. I don't know.
It's very strange because in some sense when he said he could see a life partner with a man, he's sort of saying look, bros love hanging out with bros. And I've had bromances before, but even that is sort of a species of that macho posturing to be I like dudes, I like hanging out with dudes, but when it comes to the bedroom, I'm always in there with a chick. It's strange because there's a mingling of progressive and conservative values in what he's expressing. I don't think he's retrograde. I don't think he's a deep South conservative guy saying no, I don't touch men, but he's sort of wrestling with this concept and bringing in some old notions that I thought we've sort of moved beyond.
Yeah, it's jokey, but it's you're almost watching somebody in therapy trying to work out. He's like, well, I'm okay with guys, but also I'm totally straight bro dude. So it's odd. It's to somebody in their 40s that it's trying to be this old school gay or straight, very clearly defined thing, while also I don't believe in definitions.
Yeah, that's the hard thing for me. So here's what I'm struggling with the most. Maybe you can help me. He's 44, so I don't think he's genuinely struggling with this issue. I think not
struggling with his sexuality. I think struggling with how to present it and how to talk about it.
Yes.
In his mind, he kind of genuinely doesn't really care. He's more into women, but he's not grossed out by men.
Right.
But it feels weird for him to say that.
Yes, and that's what's sort of strange. I don't know if he expected this podcast with Emily Ratajkowski, who I take it is probably a friend of his, and he had some comfort to be able to sort of talk this out in a podcast setting. But it's strange to me that the conversation went in this direction. I think he thought it would be an offhand joke and she would move on from the topic.
Right.
And when she didn't, it sort of becomes this viral sensation where we're reading news stories about what does this mean about Diplo? And I don't think he intended the conversation to move in that direction, but it did. And
maybe it's because he was sitting there talking to Emily Ratajkowski.
Right.
He's I'm suddenly reminded about how I find women very attractive.
Right. And you can sense his discomfort where he's trying to say, I'm not gay, but say that in a way that doesn't read as I'm insulted that you would think I'm gay. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Yeah. He's she's he almost got that he thought she was trying to say like, "Are you gay?" And he's like, "No, I like chicks, but also like I mess around with dudes."
It's a little of the Seinfeld, but not that there's anything wrong with that. It's like sort of the modern version of actually squirming through that conversation to say, "Hey, I'm not gay. I prefer women, but there's nothing wrong, of course, with being gay." So he's sort of having this like very awkward exchange. I think Diplo, my take is that he probably is mostly heterosexual and thought this was a joke and didn't expect it to unravel in quite this way. But I also believe, given his lifestyle, that he may have received oral sex from a man, and he's comfortable with that. And I think that's kind of like a sign of the times. You couldn't imagine a rock star in the sort of 60s and 70s having this kind of podcast conversation.
Which is funny because we know like David Bowie and Mick Jagger were jumping in bed together. Like all those dudes were doing all kinds of stuff in the 70s.
That's what's fascinating. But could you imagine them talking openly about it on a podcast with, Joan Baez?
There was sort of an example, it sounds funny now, but in 1976 or 7, Elton John did an interview with Rolling Stone and admitted that he messed around with guys. Didn't even say he was gay. He didn't fully come out then, and it hurt his career a lot.
Absolutely.
Like he still had some hits, but for like a couple years after that, he struggled a bit because people were like, "Oh no."
Yeah.
I mean, the guy in giant rhinestones and all that, like Elton John, they didn't know was gay, and when they thought he might be, oh well, we can't listen to him anymore. Which is insane.
It nearly derailed one of the greatest careers in music, and I think that's the thing to put a bow on this is I don't think this will have any impact on Diplo's career, positive or negative, and I think that's the best commentary
his audience
you can have.
Isn't the kind of audience that's going to be offended by that. You know, like at that point, like Elton John had a very classic rock audience in the 70s, and those guys were not okay with that. Diplo's fans probably, if anything, would be more upset that he's kind of hemming and hawing on it a little bit.
If anything, it shouldn't impact his career at all. It's his sexual preference. It has nothing to do with his music.
I mean, it doesn't matter
and I hope
way.
it has like no impact, positive or
won't.
negative. So anyway, we'll see what happens, but that'll do it for us today. We'll see you guys next time.